I was a 29-year-old chief revenue officer of a $7 billion company. I chose to leave, start a company in a kitchen with two people from Brazil who were 9 years younger than me.
There's lots of people who claim they work hard, but they don't actually achieve anything. How do you make sure outcomes are achieved?
When something doesn't make sense, a lot of people are afraid to ask. I don't have that fear.
Welcome to the next episode of the Entrepreneurial Excellence Podcast. Today's guest is Michael Tannenbaum, the CEO of Figure. He's built a career at the intersection of finance, technology, and leadership, turning complex systems into high-growth engines. From shaping Brex on literally, I think, as the first employee to becoming obviously one of the most recognizable FinTech brands, to recently, I guess about a year and a half, 2 years ago, becoming the CEO of Figure and helping take them public this past September. Michael, welcome to Entrepreneurial Excellence.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question I kick off with every single guest. How do you define or what does entrepreneurial excellence mean to you?
For me, it's the pursuit of building something both valuable and enduring, and doing that through both vision and a very disciplined execution. You know, a lot of people focus on the vision piece, which is a prerequisite, but I think the execution is that critical second piece as well.
Yeah, let's actually dig into that because that's a great point that to me people overlook. It's, I think, the least sexy part of building a company, but when you think through the execution or operations, the part that really makes a company what it is, what are the elements that a founder needs to get right? And how does a founder do that, right? So you've worked with obviously some of the smartest, brightest founders out there, but most founders I find in many cases are visionaries. They aren't necessarily operational executors. So what are the best ones done? And you've worked with some of the best ones out there. So what do they do to get that right?
Yeah. And I think also there's this question of like, when are founder and CEO interchangeable, and in what ways can they be, in what ways aren't they? Because often they're not, but then in some cases, like I do everything I can to act very much like a founder. And there are some differences there, which we can cover. But to get to your question of what have I seen the best founders do? I say the best founders have to have three things. They have to be able to see the world differently. They have to be great recruiters, and I think they have to work really hard. And so those are like the three things that I think are required. And those last two, the second two that I said, tie more into the execution. The work really hard is obvious. And I think the great recruiting or sell the dream, that gets into that. So what I see good founders do is they solve for things that they can't do themselves, through recruiting. And what makes founders really good is they're able to do that before it's the kind of company that most people would want to join, certainly most talented people.
Right. And so maybe talking, your early Brex days, you were employee number one, you have this amazing background, great schooling, all the other great things, right? You worked at some big investment banks, all the stuff. And SoFi, and a pretty senior person at SoFi. Why go join a company like Brex, where I'm going to get my numbers wrong, but essentially two founders who are super young, went through YC. Why go join these two founders instead of saying, I'm going to go do something myself or own all of it or all these other things? Like what made that different, and why join it?
Yeah, I was a 29-year-old chief revenue officer of a $7 billion company, and I chose to leave that position and go start a company in a kitchen with two people from Brazil who were 9 years younger than me. So that is unusual.
It's very unusual. Like, why? What did they do to convince you to leave?
I think it gets to some of the framework that I had when I was around then. I had joined SoFi in 2014, and my expectation at the time was just to learn how a business was built. I grew up interested in being involved in operating businesses, startups. I remember walking once with my dad in this nice neighborhood, and he said, Mikey, none of the people living in these houses could run a gas station. These big houses, none of them could run a gas station. And I thought, that's very interesting. And that stuck with me. And it kind of led to my interest in getting very close to businesses' details and working with them. And so I was always interested in kind of building a business from the ground up. And I came to SoFi with just the goal of learning how business really worked, because I was coming from private equity and investment banking background. And it ended up doing better at SoFi. Both the company and my career trajectory were stronger at SoFi than I expected. And as a result, I was chief revenue officer. But my goal was always kind of figure out what how building a company works and then do something on my own, whether that be found a company, join, something getting off the ground. And when I joined Brex, in some ways, I was a big part of the company early and I took a lot of risk and I was compensated for that risk. And so it felt like I was joining almost as, not as a co-founder because I wasn't, right, but as a very important role in the company with meaningful economics and a meaningful chance to build the business. I mean, the business didn't exist when I got there, and it wasn't even called Brex. It was called Beyond with a V.
But what still made being at that level that you were at SoFi, you probably had a million different options of things. You, I assume, presumably could have even stayed at SoFi and kept building your career there and growing things there. Why take a jump to go work, as you said, like for two founders who were at that point, if you were 29, they were at 20, right? So they're 20 years old from Brazil, doing a finance tech company. What, to your point of like, what makes a great founder? What did they do with recruiting to convince you that their vision was one that was worth you betting essentially your career on to some extent? Maybe not career, but it would have been a setback had it failed, let's say.
Yeah, and I gave up a lot of SoFi equity and goodwill in some ways to do this. First of all, I liked the idea a lot. First of all, like I said before, I wanted to get on the ground floor of a company. So I was interested in doing that as a concept. And then two, they were doing corporate credit card was the concept. And that was something I had experienced firsthand at SoFi. So I thought it would work. Just like I thought SoFi's concept of refinancing student loans made a ton of sense. And so fundamentally, I understood the business. And I think at the same time, this was the beginning of this era of payments integrating with SaaS. You had Square IPO'd in 2014, and they unlocked this on the acquiring side. Stripe was emerging. This idea of using software, which has zero marginal cost, to earn the right to generally more commoditized but attractive financial services revenue streams, namely interchange, right? I thought that was an interesting concept. And then to see it on the issuing side, right? If you go to a credit card transaction, Square and Stripe are on the receiving or acquiring side of payments. But on the issuing or paying side, no one had done anything. But that's actually the side that has the majority of the economics. So I thought, again, kind of economically, it was a very interesting value proposition. And I thought Enrique and Victor were good. While they were younger than me, they had started a business already in Brazil that was regulated by the central bank, and they had sold that business. And so I was impressed with them, and they were able to convince me by telling me that I had to go now or I would never be able to be involved in the company, which obviously wasn't true, but some reason I never thought about that.
They created a sense of urgency that you felt obligated to follow through on. How did they find you? Were they, like, to your point about being great recruiters as founders, were they reaching out to all the senior executives at certain financial companies? It's like, how did they identify you and say, oh, Michael might be the right person for us?
It's interesting because it's kind of shows you, and it's been my experience in my career, that sometimes the people that you expect to be the way that you find opportunity aren't necessarily the ones that bring it, and vice versa. And so this came through a lawyer named Damian Weiss, who at the time I didn't really even know him. He wasn't our lawyer at SoFi. He was just someone who had kind of pitched us business, and I barely knew him. And I think maybe either for some reason he thought that I was talented, which I think I am. So I'm glad he thought so too. And he then connected Enrique. He introduced me as an option for Enrique and Pedro. And what I did was on the weekends, I started helping them out, and I came up with their underwriting model for them just in my, on the weekend. I thought would be kind of a fun project. And I said, if I was going to underwrite startups, this is what I would do. And I told them that. I think they must have liked what I did and thought like, okay, we want this guy to be here full time. And then they started sharing their business plans with me, et cetera. And then I ended up deciding to come.
That's awesome. And so you go over there, you're employee number one, and then what? Like, what do they do? And what do you do is really, really, I mean, I would call you, like, if you're employee number one, essentially a founder, right? To make sure that you're seeing the world different, being a great recruiter of new people, and working hard and dig into all each one of those. So what I mean is maybe go backwards, right? When you say work hard, there's lots of people listening to this who all think they work hard.
Yeah, work hard is also like work effectively, right? So I guess what I was doing was pretty much everything besides so Enrique was doing all sales, Pedro was doing all engineering, and I was doing everything else, which for a credit card is enormous, right? Because we needed to get the actual we needed to get a Visa, MasterCard branded or MasterCard branded product stood up, which had to be issued by a bank. And we needed money to do that because we weren't going to use all equity. So I was basically responsible for getting us a bank that was going to sponsor what we did. And now it's relatively easy. All these banking as a service and all these companies, Marqeta, blah, blah, blah. None of that existed in 2017 when we launched this product. So we had to find a bank that was willing to sponsor us to do this product and underwrite in an innovative way. And because you can't issue a credit card without a bank in the United States. So we needed a bank to be our BIN sponsor, our bank identification number sponsor. And we also needed a bank to lend to us much more money than we had raised in equity so we could scale this business. And those things were sort of reliant on each other because the bank didn't really want to work with anyone who didn't have the capacity to do a lot of business. And the lenders didn't really want to work with anyone that didn't have a bank sponsoring the program. So it was a difficult thing to get off the ground. And I think working hard is leveraging your relationships, your knowledge of the space, to kind of put that all together and convince partners to work with you.
But I assume, but part of working hard too is you're achieving great outcomes, right? So when you think through yourself in those positions, and of course, a lot of people you probably have at Figure and you've worked with over your time at Brex, you probably had a lot of salespeople or people on your teams who like claim they're working hard, but somehow were focused on the wrong things or not achieving great outcomes. It's like, how do you measure for yourself and then for others achieving great outcomes from the work that you put in? Once again, working hard, there's lots of people who claim they work hard, but they don't actually achieve anything. So when you were achieving the outcomes you wanted, you clearly were really successful at Brex in doing that, and clearly at Figure and everywhere else. And so everywhere you've been, not everyone does that, right? You've hired lots of people who work hard but don't actually achieve outcomes. So how do you make sure outcomes are achieved in that hard work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say it's prioritization and having, you just have to be able to naturally prioritize and understand what are the priorities, because there's not always going to be someone to tell you what they are. And I think as part of prioritization, it's knowing when it's knowing 80-20 and also when the 20 matters. And so that kind of embedded in prioritization. And then I think it's a lot of proactivity. I think that as a person, I can issue spot and kind of have this sense of when something's going to go wrong or might go wrong, and then kind of act in advance of that. And by stopping those problems up front, you do save a lot of time and become much more effective execution-oriented person.
Are there any heuristics you use to help you actually make, even today, right, not just your time early at Brex, to make that 80-20 rule or decide when to be proactive? Because still, I mean, probably one of your biggest decisions today in your job as CEO is deciding where to spend your time. It's like, how do you make that decision? What are the right choices you make, and how do you make them?
I think you spend your time based on, I use this framework of big rocks, which are like the things that we're focused on. And then from there, I look at the things that I think I have a unique ability, either as myself and my skill set or my position as CEO in this case, or then as COO, where I can break trade-offs and make decisions that are going to make us move much faster. And so just going back to what I was talking about with the credit model at Brex, right? Like there is no right answer for that question. And I think this is where a lot of the things that I've been successful at come from, is like, how should Brex underwrite its, and this gets to the entrepreneurial question as well, how should Brex underwrite early stage startups that have no credit history? There is no answer to that question. And so you have to be willing to put yourself out there, use logic and ingenuity to come up with something and break trade-offs and do something different. And I think that's just comes from within. So I do that all the time, and I'll do that. And typically when you see things that aren't moving in an organization, large or small, it's because people aren't willing to do something like that or don't know how. And that's where I feel like is the highest leverage place for me. Do you think that makes sense?
It does. And then, but you also need to create a culture where people feel like they can take that proactive step and make a decision. So like, obviously Brex had that. I assume you're trying to do the same thing at Figure, where people don't need to run through you all the time to get the answer. How do you create a culture where people can make those decisions and feel comfortable doing that without there being just constant like checks on what they do?
I think you create the culture by having a system of goals and measurement of those goals. And so if it's very clear what the goal is, like for Figure, most of our goals are volume based, right? At the end of the day, we're running a blockchain marketplace of loans, and we want that volume to go higher. And so if we're doing things that move that primary metric, that people are focused on that, and if we're able to measure it based on what they do, then there's not a lot of debate or involvement from me needed roughly there. I think it's when we're going to be setting other priorities beyond that, or projects that don't so clearly map, that you would have me again doing kind of what we were talking about before.
So diving in those areas. What happened with, so going back to great recruiters, going through your three things. So great recruiters, what else do you try to do as a great recruiter, presumably even today? And how do you keep that flow going when you have a million things on your plate?
Yeah, I think there's couple different flavors of great recruiters. I think from what I've seen, the things that I think I do well, one is I'm always recruiting. So just as an example, we just had someone start as a corp dev intern here who I met in a capacity of where this person was like at a hedge fund. We met, very unlikely to be, he's probably 4 years old, interning with us, right? And I'm like, look, why don't you come here, learn what we do? Because he left his hedge fund, see if it fits. And, that's the way that we could get someone like that, right? I can't offer that person a full-time job today as head of corp dev because he doesn't have the experience, and he wouldn't come for the comp that we'd be willing to pay until we sort of try him out. So I think I'm always sort of recruiting it in any scenario. So increasing top of funnel. But I also think that example speaks to being a realistic recruiter, right? I think that some people do this thing of like, we just need to get the best talent in the door no matter what. And that was a little bit the approach we took at Brex, which I think it can work, but it's not my approach. I think that there are certain roles that are extremely high leverage, and there's certain roles where you actually don't want to get necessarily someone who's super ambitious, super motivated. If you fill the entire company with that, I think that breaks too, because not everybody can be promoted and move throughout the organization at the same pace that, say, I have done in my career. And as you've already noted on this call, not everybody may think that they work as hard as me and are as effective, but they're not being rude, right? And so I think that you need to have room for all types.
So do you think, so that goes against a little bit of some conventional wisdom where people say you just should only recruit A players, basically? So you're sort of saying, maybe put words in your mouth, tell me if this is correct, essentially saying I want a bunch of A players in key positions, but maybe we need some Bs here and there because not everyone can be an A.
I think that's roughly right. Yeah. And I think the problem, which other people listening would say is, well, when those B players bring C players. And so what you would have to do if you're doing what I do is you would have to know the roles where you need A players and have the mechanics in place to prevent B players from recruiting C players. But like when people say, you can't have B players because they recruit C players, well, there's the 11th commandment isn't that B players shall recruit C players, right? That's just what tends to happen. So you could have another mechanism. And I think this also gets into like, what's your business, right? And what are the margins? And do you have, if you're Stripe and you're structurally really high margin, like, sure, maybe you can hire A players in every role, but that's not every business.
Yeah. How do you make sure you create the processes and systems in place to recruit to keep your levels at a B player or above? Like, what have you seen set up to avoid the C's and only get the B's or A's?
Well, and also this gets to how many people are you even recruiting, right? So if you look at a company like Figure, we're today, in the 8 billion market cap. We are in the, publicly traded. So let's call us in the high threes, 100 millions, low 400 millions revenue, depending on whether you're looking forward or today, right? And we're operating with around 450, 500 people. And so when you're operating with that number of people and you kind of add somewhere between 10 and 30 people a quarter, right? You're talking about somewhere between 3 and 10 people a month. Like you can, depending on the role, get involved in that, right? Even as the founder like that or the CEO, that's not unreasonable to be the final sign off and or interview for 50 to even 100% of those roles. And so I think a lot of the conventional wisdom you hear in Silicon Valley comes from this notion of blitzscaling, like we just need to add people left and right. And sure, if you're going to add people left and right and there's no systems and processes, then yeah, the best strategy, if you're going to just throw money at everything and add people everywhere, then the best strategy is just add the best people. And I think if I was running OpenAI today, like that would be my strategy. I don't think OpenAI needs to take anybody less than, an A in every role. And they probably are adding, so many people that they don't even know what to do with. That is a playbook, but I'm just saying that you're not going to run that playbook at every company.
Right. Most companies are not OpenAI, right? Most companies, you need people who are great, but you don't need the same sort of pace and speed of hiring that, a land grab in like a OpenAI type of world.
Yeah. And I think the best people know where they are and when they're not there. I think in the beginning of Brex, for example, we were in that kind of moment and we did do that. And I think that made sense. And then I think as your company matures and the market matures, you've got to pivot from there.
When do you use compensation? Like, what are the right levers in recruiting? So is it compensation, culture, role, title? How do you like to use those? And how does it maybe change as the company matures as well?
Yeah, I think you want to really understand what is the person is valuing, because there are going to be those people. Again, it goes to understanding what the person wants and also what you can offer that person. You'll find, or I've found in my career, that there's going to be people who are very comp oriented, but most people aren't. Most people are oriented because they want to have fun. They want at work, right? They're looking to do something interesting. And you can get a lot of talented people. It's something I learned at SoFi, who are later in their career, who actually are financially self-sufficient and just want to be part of something that's part of the future, right? They just want to be part of the future. And so you can get a lot of people that are maybe not necessarily focused on the $20,000 increase in salary, but are just focused on, look, I'm so excited to be here and be a part of what we're doing and learn. And that's a huge segment of the talent pool in the market, right? There's a lot of people who are successful who are no longer among quality people to recruit, right? A lot of people are already successful and aren't necessarily motivated by only money. Then you get people who are interested in expanding their scope, right? They may be, I was a chief of staff, but I don't want to be a career chief of staff. And when I hear that opportunity, I'm like, okay, this person might be interested in, I might be able to afford this person for this role because a version of their comp is that they get to do something a bit different, right, than what they've done previously. And I think that's a form of comp too, is learning and expanding and diversifying. And so I think at least my approach is to understand what we can pay in all these types of compensation, which is just not only cash and stock. Understand what we can pay, but also understand what people are looking for, and then you can get that match.
Do you teach your teams to try to listen for what that person is really looking for once they come in the door? Like, how do you help train people to listen properly for that? Because I think a lot of people just default back to cash compensation, title, sort of simplistic things.
I probably could do a better job of that, hearing you ask that question. However, there's a few people that I've spent a lot of time with teaching them that approach. And that, again, back to 80-20, right? Like, it's probably not that effective for me to go teach this to every person managing 2 to 3 people. I think where I've tried to do this importantly is around the teams that manage lots of people, which are typically engineering and operations. And so that's where I'm going to spend more time on this concept. And that's where you also need to have, I think, the right systems in place that allow people to progress through their career, because people always want to feel like they're making progress. And so how do you set up systems within large groups of people that allow for that? Because you can't do this kind of one-on-one career planning and mentorship in organizations of 50 to 250 people as well.
Yeah, no, completely. You need to keep changing what you do and how you do it each time the company makes a big change. And speaking of that a little bit, how did that work for you at Brex? I mean, you were at Brex for like 9 or 10 years. I have it right here. Almost 8.5 years, right? So like, exactly. How did you handle the constant changes? I mean, like, that must have been, I think Brex for a long time was almost like blitzscaling, right? Just massive growth. They hit on to me that was perfectly timed for the market. The market needed it. How did you keep changing the systems internally to manage that? I mean, you were CFO, CBO, COO, every sort of title there, essentially.
Well, in the beginning, as you said, our goal was just to grow as fast as we could. We felt it was a land grab. And I think that was it's the big macro moments that sort of, at least for us at Brex, that changed how we approach things. So founded in 17, kind of approached that way until 2020. COVID changed things pretty materially. But then it was also pretty clearly an e-commerce boom during COVID, which was a big part of what we did. And so kind of following those key macro trends and leaning into that, because anything digital at that time was booming. But then that quickly changed in sort of the fall of 21. It began to change early 22 rates and started to change inflation. And then the environment really changed. And we then had to pivot again to be more, reflect that environment of more austerity, within SVB being quite a big moment for the early stage tech ecosystem, of which Brex is such a big part of. That moment was then clearly a time for all hands on deck and a focus on systems risk, fraud, but and then at the same time, I think we did a great job capitalizing on that opportunity. So for me, a lot of these things were kind of macro.
And so focusing on even the macro pieces where they're key. I mean, are there things you have to do, you think, as a founder or as a company builder to manage the change you're going through these different elements? So these macro pieces, like how do you change on a dime, right? The SVB, we definitely want to talk about the SVB stuff, but like, how do you change a company on a dime, especially as you're getting bigger and bigger? But even at every stage, right? When you double, you go from 5 to 10 people, 10 to 20, 20 to 40. Each of those for many companies are really big change moments, and not every company survives that. So how do you, as a leader, reorient the company every single time to handle that growth?
I think experience helps with this, right? Because you've seen success at other organizations. So a lot of the things we're talking about you're not reinventing the wheel in terms of organizational design and adding people and systems and goals and processes. So if you've been on the ground floor of, like, I joined company SoFi, 75 people, scaled it through 1,100. So then bringing that same experience to Brex, of course, I didn't see 0 to 75, but I had a rough sense of what 75 should look like, and 0 is 0. So there's not that much in between there. And so I think, and now I've done that a couple of times. And so I do think experience is very helpful in that. And if you don't have that as a founder, you should recruit someone who does. So that gets to that. In terms of like reorienting company on a dime, we have a unique period of history where we had both COVID and SVB for being quite relevant for us. It wasn't as relevant for others. I don't necessarily know that you're going to have moments like that all the time where things need to totally change. I think in FinTech, you do a bit more. And I think that gets to that, something of that level requires major changes to goals, big rocks, OKRs, and sort of a whole system and kind of all hands on deck approach.
Yeah, I mean, I assume when that crisis occurred with SVB, for those who don't know, SVB essentially went out of business overnight, and everyone's cash was seemingly lost. And this is essentially the entire startup ecosystem was banking with SVB. It's the main one, obviously Brex and others. Did you guys just call an all hands immediately? And we're like, we need to solve this and get things fixed? Because your money was also locked up at SVB, right? You had some money there too. So how do you deal with the fact that your money might be in trouble and you have all the other clients and customers whose money is also in trouble? Like,
we didn't even have time to do an all hands there. It just sort of emerged. I remember at that time being super glad. I know like the world has kind of moved on from remote work, but at the time I was so glad we were remote for SVB because of the multiple Zoom rooms we needed. And if we were all running around an office, like I didn't even have time to move. I was in a garage at SFO. I couldn't even get on the plane when my family was going skiing. And I stayed there, and I remember I was like peeing in the parking lot because I couldn't even leave
just on call so much. You're just like, I can't.
It was so crazy. Yeah, I mean, for us, at least for SVB, we had maybe 600-700 million with SVB the day before, and I just happened to be in San Francisco, even though I live in New York area, and it was just going crazy. And I remember like there was this debate about like whether we move the money or whether we don't. And like, this was one of the times where I just used even though I wasn't a founder, I just said, this is what we're doing, because there was sort of debate about like, well, we have a partnership with SVB and some people on our board were saying to keep it there. And I was just like, listen, guys, I don't know what anybody's saying, but like I was a bank's M&A banker. I'm like, banks go banks fail. The FDIC comes in and we don't need to be any part of this. I don't care what anyone's saying. I had already confirmed the day before that we could actually move the money. I remember being shocked that we could just move 700 million like that with no callback or nothing. And I remember even thinking wow, if I was running this bank, I would be stopping this. I would, even if it's not allowed, I would be hey, you need this signature. I would do something to slow it down.
Come up with a million excuses to slow it down.
Yeah, or cut the phone lines. I don't know, something just life or death. But we got it. We moved all the money, and I was and if we hadn't moved that money, we wouldn't have been in a position to capitalize on the opportunity so much, because we were able to go after business and win business, frankly, from SVB and other banks for the deposit product at Brex. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we were worried about our own balance sheet. Yeah. And I think that was a very pivotal moment. And I remember just saying, this is what we're doing. We got to go. I told Pedro, the CEO at the time, and still the CEO, I was Pedro, this is what we're doing. And he was absolutely great. That was it.
Boom, money's out. So that was one sort of crisis that you obviously didn't manufacture. I would love to talk a little bit about, if you're open to it, sort of one that SVB famously did almost to themselves, right? Where SVB had a strategic shift to some extent, where it'd say, hey, we're not going to work with the startup ecosystem anymore. And from my perspective as a startup founder, it really hurt the mindset of people in the startup ecosystem, and to some extent opened the door to a lot of other competitors who came afterwards. And I'm sure there was a strategic decision about doing that. In
Brex or SVB?
Brex making that decision to kind of move away from the startup ecosystem, which I think in retrospect, because they very much come back into the startup ecosystem in a strong way, was the wrong decision. But at the time was obviously something you thought was strategically sound. What was the decision process that went around that?
Well, I think the decision process, the way you described it, wasn't how we thought of it, which I think is probably the first issue, which is we thought we were exiting small businesses, but not startups. Right. And I think that the fundamental, so that I would describe that whole issue you're referring to, which I think was June 22. That issue was a communications issue.
Yeah.
Because ultimately we thought we were doing something that we didn't communicate properly, and the market interpreted as we were giving up on startups.
I mean, we got calls from our customers saying, hey, it basically was almost like an SVB bank run to some extent. People were like, is Brex shutting this down? Do we need to move our money immediately? And we're like, I don't think so, but this is sort of unclear whether you should move it just to be safe. And yeah, it was people.
So I think it gets to this kind of this ivory tower way that you can get in your own company with your own terms and your own KPIs. And we were thinking small businesses are different than startups, and we're going to differentiate because startups have venture backing. And I think we didn't quite anticipate that didn't anticipate at all that someone who wasn't in our four walls, how they would hear it. Mm. We did. So we thought let's pull the plug on sort of a money losing business line, which was serving small businesses. And the logic was sound, right? It was this idea that a lot of these non-venture backed businesses would come to Brex and they would expect credit because we were known as a credit card company, but then we couldn't give them that. So we'd have these accounts that kind of went nowhere, and people were disappointed, and it was high cost to serve, and they were clogging the phones, and all the reasons why you make those decisions. But in hindsight, it was clearly communicated poorly, and we probably should have just stopped adding new ones, slowly wound them down, and found a different way to manage those internally, or get a separate phone line, right? There was a lot of things we could have done to improve, but we're just all kind of marching towards the wrong decision. And I think we had, without blaming any individuals, I think that we had hired some people that were big company people. Mm. And that's the kind of thing a big company would do, right? Like you said, SVB or somebody we're exiting this business line, right? And that's a very corporate speak approach. And I think we communicated in a very corporate-y way, as if we were IBM or something, exiting a business line and pursuing strategic alternatives for it. And so it was weird. And I think people picked up on that. And that was definitely one of the worst days of my life.
Yeah.
But there were many bad days. So that was only one of them. But yes.
There are many, many, many bad days in every business. But what do you think? Was it did Brex and your team, did you guys lose the focus on, like, how does a company make sure they don't lose that focus and saying, hey, like, we still want to treat everyone well. We want to treat all of our customers in a great way. We maybe don't want to always do the splashy big announcement because like that seems sexy. We're going to cut it off and move quickly, but maybe that's not the right way to go. How do you fight against that, especially as you get bigger?
I think this is where this is kind of getting back to what I was saying, where you have like these things that are kind of like going wrong. I keep touching my ear because there's a Portuguese phrase that I learned from the Brazilian co-founders called pulga atrás da orelha. It's like when you have a tick in your ear. And sometimes like you get into these things in work where there's like a group of people like doing stuff, and like often a vendor selection can go this way, and like everyone's like thinks they're doing the right thing and they're all like aligned, quote, and getting alignment and checking in with stakeholders, but like they're really doing nothing. And what they're doing is wrong. And that's when if you're in charge, you need to come in over the top and say, this is not what we're doing. Like, this doesn't make sense. Like, you're all optimizing for your own little thing, but like the right thing to do is obviously this. And I think that's a little bit what happened there. It was like, finance signs off and comm signs off, and everybody has like, we think this is the right thing to do. But what we should have done is said, this makes no sense. We're going to go tell 30,000 people we're getting out of their business and they have to shut down their account. It's going to be mayhem. And why would we think that, and why also did we do it all at once? Why didn't we just start with 5% of the people and see what happened? And then we could have, if we just done it that way, which would be the obvious way, like who said we had to do it all at once? And if we did it to 5% of people and they started freaking out, well, that would have been a very different outcome.
So essentially you're saying it's sort of like everyone's saying yes, and then the leadership team sort of says, okay, well, every team here says yes, we want to show trust in our leadership.
Bottoms up versus tops down.
Yeah. And so do you then try as a leader not to be, but you got to be careful not to be tops down all the time, because if you're undermining everyone's decision, then no one feels like they have any ability.
Right. But I think this is the kind of thing where tops down is required. There's certain things where, that yes, absolutely. And if you're going to do tops down for everything, you might as well just be a tyrant and not hire anyone, or hire very, people that just do what you say, which is not my suggestion. But I think in things like that are make or break the company, SVB, what you just mentioned, like they're one throat to choke. It can't be like, well, I don't know, the marketing wanted to do it,
So essentially, it's sort of the Jeff Bezos idea of like one-way or two-way doors. If it's a one-way door, you can't go back from it. That needs extra scrutiny and really sign off directly from leadership saying it's really going to be best in serving our customers.
Yeah, and I'd put M&A in that category too, right? I think M&A is another thing that I've seen get wrong a lot, where it's like no one really owns it and we're just kind of like going with it. Everyone's like, yeah, this is good. But like, is there someone who's like, I feel responsible for this? And if that person's not the CEO, like that person, their job should be on the line, as should the CEOs. Right?
And so on that note, actually, maybe just to go quickly into M&A side, essentially saying like the person who wants to do the deal, saying to them, hey, look, you're responsible not only just to close the deal, but to make sure it's a success over the next 12 months at a minimum. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, and I actually listened to Alex Bouaziz from Deal talked about this on a recent podcast, which I thought was interesting. It was like, if you're going to do M&A, like someone should be really excited and jumping up and down, like, we got to have this, because they go wrong so much. I've seen them go wrong always. I've never seen it go right. I know obviously it does go right, but it hasn't for me or any company I've been a part of. And so I think you really need to say, like, you should be jumping up and down. I agree with him on that. And I think that this gets to the same thing, which I feel like what the M&As that I've seen, it's a lot of like, oh, well, like, yeah, finance sees how this could work and marketing thinks there's some value here. And like, yeah, like, why not? And it's like, I don't think that's a reason to buy a company. It's not why not, it's why.
Yeah. I mean, arguably, it can make the same argument for almost every, like, hiring people on your team or making these big decisions, like all these things, right? It should almost be basically saying, hey, look, are we ecstatic that it's going to be valuable? Or is someone trying to do this because it's the easy thing to say yes to? Or it promotes some internal thing that, I've seen this happen in big companies. You hire some senior person, they come on and say, we need to do this big change and it's going to take 12 months and I don't really know what the outcome's going to be. And it's like, well, are you just doing this because you need a project and something to own?
Totally agree. And I think that's definitely something that I try and push back on heavily.
So going back to your third point, which is seeing the world differently for founders, define that a little bit more. Like, how everyone who starts a company presumably thinks they see the world differently because they have some idea of a product they want to build, something that's different. Yet you and I both know well, most products never take off. right? Their idea is actually not all that different or that unique or that special. And maybe they don't really see the world all that differently. So like what really sets people apart? What really makes someone truly think different? Like what does a really different thinker look like? And you can use yourself as an example, right? You've been so successful in so many ways, which clearly means you're thinking differently than the average person. Otherwise, you'd still be just an average employee, not a senior leader at some of the top finance companies out there.
It comes from the ability to, one, think very principled, like kind of logic approach, which I know is popular in Silicon Valley, but something that I ascribe to, I think.
Like first principles.
First principles, yeah. Like, and I was taught that actually in private equity, which is like, just think about a business from its first principles, not like all these decisions we're saying, just try to apply logic to them. That sounds so easy and obvious, but you get into all these worlds where people have all kinds of other stuff like, oh, I just did this comp review as an example that I was just arguing with someone about. They were sort of coming up with all these relative ways of how we can look at comp and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, don't we just have peers that we look at? And then what is the comp that they're offering? And do we think that what percentile do we want to be? And then isn't that the answer? But like, there's this whole thing about, well, when did someone join? And, all these other things that don't really matter and aren't how it should work and aren't logical. And so I guess I think it starts with a first principle thinking. And I also think then you get into sort of like experience and what you can't have in experience, because if you're somewhat inexperienced, which of course I am in some ways, and I'm experienced in other ways, everyone's like that. It's about pattern matching, right? And trying to apply what works, what you've seen work and how it can apply to what you do today, but not pattern matching the wrong things, which a lot of people do too. So I don't necessarily know if I can identify that blueprint, to be honest.
Fair enough. But I would like, speaking about it related to it, you mentioned briefly kind of your growing up and what that looked like and some of the stuff your dad told you and how to think through things. Walk us through that a little bit. Like, how did you get down the path that you went through overall in life? And once again, you stuck out in ways that put you in the positions you're at, which, to be clear, many of your peers, even, I think you went to Columbia, if I recall, like many of your peers from where you went to school and other things like that, like are not in positions you're in. So what do you think made you different? Is it from your childhood? What did you learn that kept pushing you forward to where you are today?
Yeah, I think that so my dad was a CFO of startups, biotech, sort of the business in Boston, where we're from. And he was not a sports guy, but I remember in the backyard, we'd have these barbecues for the summer. There'd be all these people. Boston's very sports, there'd be.
Of course, being non-sportsy in Boston is, you're sticking out like a sore thumb and you've seen the world.
So, and he was from New York, and there'd be Red Sox jerseys and Patriots and Celtics, etc. And he would have these barbecues, and he'd be able to relate to everybody because he really knew the details of what the business was. And so he knew the intricacies of these people's jobs. And I would watch him and he'd say, oh, how's it going? He was the CFO. So, in the AP, you're doing this and that. And he'd be able to relate to them with humor and understanding their job. And I picked that up. And I thought, I'm going to kind of do what he did and really get into the details of everything and use that as a way to relate to people, because they're going to know that I understand what they do. And so when I'm managing people that are twice or sometimes, 3 times my age, I'm going to be able to at least see them where they are in terms of how they're doing their job and my understanding of that. And I think I took those details and then was able to kind of zoom out and create a new vision for how things could be, whether it be, with card and expense management, or now with blockchain, the capital markets, and like use the details to kind of change the way things are done and make sure you really understand them. Because one of the powers of FinTech is you got to make it work across finance, capital markets, tech, and regulatory, and kind of putting those pieces together. You need the details to make it work. You can't just do whatever you want in financial services because those details matter, but you need to also be able to zoom out by understanding those to see how the world could be different. And I think that is what I've been able to do successfully across, all the companies.
So do you think that, are you sort of saying it's making sure you understand the nuances of each individual as like a person on your team, or at least your senior team, and then also understanding the details of the role? Like, but one thing that's still hard to do, right? You have to be, clearly you're very smart, but are there ways you try to do that you can go deep, or is it just working harder than everyone else?
No, it's not just working harder. I think it's being willing to ask the questions and spend the time on the details of the business that other people just wouldn't. Right. I mean, I've come across lots of people, and it gets to your point. Everyone thinks they're hardworking. Everyone also thinks they're detail oriented. You're never going to meet someone like, oh, no, I'm not in the details. Like, who's going to say that? Yep. Maybe 10% of the people. Right. But I think it's like when something doesn't make sense, a lot of people are afraid to ask. I don't have that fear. So I'll say, what are you saying? And then oftentimes you'll realize the person doesn't even know, or it's wrong. And so I think, like, for me, I have enough confidence over the years to know that if I don't really understand or I'm questioning, it's more than likely that there's a problem. And so I kind of follow, again, back to kind of following those things that seem off. I really hunt those down and I make sure I understand exactly what's going on. And I don't think everybody does that. And I don't think that's just about hard work. I think it's spending the time up front when you join an organization to really understand what that organization does, get on the sales calls, get into the customer views, speak with the engineers. Why is Extra architected this way? What are the limitations? Why are we doing this? I think that type of thing is not necessarily what everyone does.
So there's essentially a level of like curiosity that you think differentiates you.
Yeah, but in a curiosity can be academic. And even though I did go to, I guess, a good school by most measures, I don't think it's about curiosity, but I think it's more about an understanding of how relevant things work. Because I think you could be curious all over the place and that could get you nowhere.
Right. Yeah. You need to be curious in the right ways and about the right things, essentially, in making sure that flows through. And then, so then you go to school, you start taking this path. And then what made you decide to get out of M&A, investment banking, that sort of work, and go into SoFi?
That was the influence of my father. I wanted to get out of the ground floor of a company. I wanted to get into a company. I didn't want to be in private. That was the gas station concept, right? This idea that I wanted to know how to run a gas station. I felt like private equity, you could get really, really affluent, do your thing, great for those people. But I think many of them could not run a gas station, and I wasn't interested in being among those people.
And you just kept pushing yourself then to keep getting better and better every day.
Like, honestly, the growth wasn't there. I mean, I think a personality like mine requires to, I'm a person that benefits when there's a lot of growth in the company because you can really grow and advance. And I think in private equity, at least when I joined, which was 2012, that asset class was maturing. And I remember I was like futzing around with some papers trying to get ready for an investment committee. And one of the senior partners said to me, because I was like putting together this stupid presentation, I thought it was stupid, but I mean, it sort of was. And he was like, when I joined this company, this firm, like, things were so busy that we didn't even have time to put together these presentations because things were just flying off the shelves. We had deals to do and we're making so much money. And he's like, it's really changed looking at you doing this. And I thought, like, yeah, I'm getting the hell out of here. Like, it's great for some people, but I do think that asset class is totally matured, and like you can make good money, just like investment banking matured, and tech will mature, right? Or versions of tech will mature. I mean, tech's a little different, but big tech has matured for sure, right? I mean, that's why it's called big tech. But like, the idea that you're going to show up at Google today, maybe there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that you really rise to the top fast, but that's just, those opportunities aren't available there anymore. And that's natural. And so I felt like the private equity asset class was really maturing and I wanted to get on the ground floor of a company.
What do you recommend to new people today? Is it the same idea? Because so many people from top schools are still going to like consulting, banking, and there's some that go to tech, but they don't go to startup tech. They go work at Google. And it's like, oh, wow, I did it. And it's like, is that really leading you towards being not an entrepreneurial mindset? And probably not, but
probably not. I remember watching that Facebook movie, The Social Network, or 2011, and I was in New York, and I was like, oh, I'm the guy in New York. Like, I need to be in San Francisco. And I moved. Basically, I got a private equity job in San Francisco as a result, because I was like, I gotta go. Things are different in New York, San Francisco today, and it's changed a little bit. But in general, yeah, I think if you know what and it's funny because I was in a fraternity in college, and I had a friend who's now actually the chief business officer of Perplexity. He's 2 years older than me. But he went to go join Facebook at a school. And since we were in New York, Columbia, we were like laughing at him. We were like, ha, 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 what are you going to do? Like, check our profiles? Like, we didn't even know like that was a job that you could work at. I didn't even understand what you could do at Facebook. I didn't even realize it was a company. I was like, oh, it's just a website. I don't even, or an app, right? And so it was like, my mindset really changed. And so I think I didn't know is my point, right? I was kind of in a different world. And my parents told me I was not allowed to go to college in California. I didn't even look at Cal or Stanford, which have been the two places I would have been interested in. They were like, no, why would you go that far? I'd never been to California until 2012. When I interviewed in the private equity, I'm from Boston, in New England, people, if they go on vacation, they tend to go to Europe, not California, or wherever. But so I never even been, I didn't even really know there was Pacific time, honestly. Like I never thought about Pacific time. It was when I got there, I'm like, so I knew about Central time because they say that it's on 8 Eastern, 7 Central on TV. But I never thought about Pacific time. So I didn't even know to go. But if I hadn't known to go, I probably would have just gone direct. I would advise people, if you know, go. But the problem is picking, and it's hard to pick the right one.
Right. And that's the really difficult part. I mean, how do you decide still? Like, obviously you made the decision with Brex, you made the decision with SoFi, you made these like choices to go and figure as well, like these fast growing companies. How does one make that choice? Because the biggest decision you make is like what you're going to spend your time on in your career. And you could get it wrong. Like, I mean, I still remember when Facebook came out, I should have said, screw it, I'm not going to law school and business school, which is what I did after college. Right. And I got Facebook my senior year in college, which was one of the first universities that got it. I should be like, I wanted to be in tech. I should have said, screw it, I'm going straight west and I'm going to go do whatever it takes to work at Facebook. I'll work there for free because this thing is a rocket ship. Yet I didn't. And I think most people don't make that choice, but you did. You didn't do it for Facebook, but you went there and did it for Brex.
Like, yeah, I mean, shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? Like, sure. I think for me, yeah, I think that but I had the framework. I needed to go to SoFi to get that framework to be able to assess, to get a company off the ground and what actually happened. And so I think SoFi was more the unique thing that I picked. Brex, I felt at the time actually was quite obvious. I thought it was going to work. My wife thought it was going to work. She wasn't my wife at the time. But she was my fiance. So that I kind of thought would work because I knew enough, but it was SoFi that was the hard one. And I think with SoFi, the big thing was there was this big opportunity. I really understood the business. It made sense to me. And also, we haven't talked about this, but I had a mentor there willing to grow and develop me. And I could identify that even when I got there. And I try to offer that to people now. They don't always receive it. But I think if you have someone senior who's pushing for you, that's really valuable.
If you have one piece of advice or a single piece of advice for every single founder to be successful as an entrepreneur or as a leader in entrepreneurial companies, what would that single piece of advice be?
My one single piece of advice, I would say get as close to the details as possible.
Yeah, just get right in there. Well, Michael, thank you so much. How can people get in touch if they want to learn more? They want to learn more about what you're doing at Figure. Obviously, you're a publicly traded company, so they can get more there. How do they get in touch? How do they learn more about you, what you're doing? How do they try to emulate your type of career path that you managed to build for yourself?
I post a lot to LinkedIn, and we're doing a lot of interesting things at Figure. So check us out, figure.com, read our blog, and you can always email me, mtannenbaum@figure.com.
Excellent. Michael, thank you so much for your time. It's precious. I appreciate you spending some time with me, myself, and our audience. Thank you again.